It didn't take long for single mom Lisa Jefferson to fall under the spell of her charming neighbor, Cecil Torrance.
Cecil was a very handsome guy. He was tall, he had brains, he was very sharp.
Lisa was in love, she glowed, they were doing really well.
But all of Cecil's charms were only masking a hidden darkness.
He was just a volcano ready to erupt.
A darkness that would lead police on an all-out manhunt.
He was on the loose, armed and dangerous.
And leave Lisa's life shattered.
I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, this is it. I am definitely going to die.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. In the summer of 1995, 18-year-old Lisa Jefferson was a young mother in transition. After ending a relationship with the father of her 2-year-old son, she made the tough call to move from Texas back to her hometown of Syracuse, New York, for a fresh start.
I think it was a lot that I was missing my family. They were everything to me. Then I had my grandmother on the phone saying, come home to grandma so that I can take care of you. And I had to make a decision. It was not an easy thing.
Lisa's grandmother welcomed her and her son Carlos Jr. into her home with open arms.
I'm starting over again, but I'm happy to start over again. I was focused on how I was going to rebuild my life with my son.
But there were plenty of men whose sole focus was on her. And one in particular, Cecil Torrance, a neighbor in Lisa's apartment complex, was determined to make an impression.
Cecil was a very handsome guy. Now, he was tall, he was dark. He was such a charming guy, but I wasn't looking to get into another relationship really fast, and I just wanted to be kind of free.
Cecil just kept wanting to get a date. He would do anything that she wanted to do just to, to grab her attention.
But after several weeks of casual flirting, Lisa finally gave in to Cecil's advances and was pleasantly surprised.
He would always take me out to eat, and we'd have good conversation. He was definitely rough around the edges, and I kind of liked it. Nobody was going to push him around.
Cecil worked in construction and had 2 little girls of his own. Even though they lived with his ex, he seemed to be just as devoted a parent as Lisa. Soon, Cecil and Lisa became more than just friends.
I fell head over heels for him. People knew that was Cecil's girl, and it kind of made me feel important.
It all happened really fast. He treated her like a princess.
When Lisa landed a job at a department store, it seemed like life was going her way.
And I started to say, okay, girl, you got the looks, and now you got demand. You can provide for your child, and the confidence definitely started to grow.
And in April of 1996, when Lisa discovered she was pregnant with a boy, she was overjoyed by Cecil's excited reaction to the news.
Cecil said, we're gonna be a family, we're gonna bring Carlos Jr., and we're gonna move in together. We were picking out colors together, and just high anticipation of the birth of his first boy.
On Christmas Day of 1996, Lisa and Cecil received a very special delivery, Cecil Jr. Lisa thought she had it all. Unfortunately, her family thought otherwise.
Once she had the baby and they moved in together, I think that's when all the change came. The not going out, the not being around the family, and gotta cook and clean, and everything has to be ran accordingly. I didn't like that at all.
Cecil was a very jealous guy. One time, a coworker invited me and a couple other girls to her house for dinner. He called my phone about 50 million times while I was there, arguing with me about something that was so minute, I couldn't understand it, but then it clicked to me. Cecil is very insecure.
So when Lisa got home, she assured Cecil that she only had eyes for him, and that seemed to do the trick.
He's apologizing, he's sorry. I love you, just stay home with me.
In those moments, Lisa fell in love with her man all over again, despite her family's disapproval.
I loved Cecil. I loved him. I loved our family. I loved the life that we were trying to build. And I wanted the American dream.
But soon Lisa would see her dream turn into a living nightmare.
I never thought in a million years he would go to the extreme.
Cecil's jealousy was about to hit a whole new level.
There was nowhere for me to run. There was nowhere for me to hide. I was terrified.
In the summer of 1999, Lisa Jefferson and her boyfriend Cecil Torrance were enjoying watching their blended family grow.
We actually moved into a new place. Carlos Jr.'s in school now, and I found a new job at a customer service company, and so everything's going good.
And Cecil's jealous tendencies had all but disappeared. He was quite the doting dad.
Cecil would watch the boys while I was at work. Cecil was an excellent father.
And when Cecil landed a construction job with potential for growth, the young family was on their way.
Cecil is getting paid a lot of money. I'm feeling good about myself. He's feeling good about himself. We're a little power couple. There was just that one piece missing. I wasn't Mrs. Torrance.
So in the summer of 2001, after adding their second baby boy to the blended family, the couple decided it was time to make their union official. In the fall of 2001, Lisa walked down the aisle and into the arms of her adoring Cecil.
It wasn't a big, extravagant wedding, but it was a very beautiful, beautiful day. I was over the moon.
He was happy, she was happy. They looked great together.
Life was good for the newlyweds, until 2 months later when Cecil suddenly lost his job.
Cecil started to change when he got laid off. And after applying over and over again at different organizations and getting no feedback, I think it just killed his spirits. And that's when everything started going downhill. He's staying out very late at night, coming in at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, drunk. It started to really, really affect our relationship.
One day in January of 2003, Cecil took his drunken debauchery too far.
Cecil comes home at 5 o'clock in the morning with friends. They're drinking, they're kind of loud. I'm upset. And I look at Cecil, I said, what's going on here? Well, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, just go to bed, babe. You know, everything's gonna be fine. They'll be out of here in a little while. I wake up to Cecil passed out drunk, and his pager's going off. So I decided that, okay, it must be important, let me call this person back. I ended up calling the number back, and it was a female's voice.
Lisa was furious, and for once, she demanded to know where Cecil had been. And that's when Lisa's husband exploded with a fury she had never seen before.
He grabbed me by my hair, and he started punching me in my face. I was scared, and I couldn't get away from him. There was nowhere for me to run. There was nowhere for me to hide. And he wouldn't stop. I'm begging him to please stop. You're gonna kill me. He didn't care.
Cecil finally relented and left the room. Lisa quickly called 911. Cecil spent the next 2 days in jail, while Lisa stayed with family, nursing 2 black eyes and a fractured nose.
I couldn't believe it. He came across as a kind person. He didn't give off any indication that he was just a volcano ready to erupt.
Lisa pressed charges, and Cecil was ordered to attend 6 months of counseling. 1 week later, when Lisa returned home to pick up a few necessities, Cecil was waiting and singing a different tune.
He was begging and pleading and crying, and I'm like, no, no, no. Look what you did to me. How could I come back to you?
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
He's like, I was drunk and, you know, I didn't know what I was doing. I love you. I'm going to counseling now, crying.
Horrified by the violence Cecil had shown, Lisa was prepared to walk away. But the thought of breaking up her family was too painful to bear.
I didn't want to be a single mother. My mom was a single mother. I want my boys to have something I didn't have, which is a father and a mother in the same household.
So Lisa felt compelled to give her family a second chance.
He went to counseling where he learned about empathy, what triggers him to become this way. He did great, and everything started to get on the right path.
He showed her he could be the perfect man for her and her kids.
Lisa was happy to put the ugly chapter behind them and plan for the family's future. But Cecil had plans of his own.
The violence certainly escalated, and it led to the worst act that you could imagine.
And before Lisa could see the truth hiding behind his sinister eyes, her world would change forever.
As blood splattering everywhere, I just knew that would be my last time here on Earth.
In the summer of 2005, after her husband Cecil went through counseling for striking her, Lisa Torrance decided to give him one more chance for the sake of their kids.
He was going to be a better husband to me in every way, shape, or form.
And even though Cecil had failed to land a job, it seemed he'd found his true calling at home.
Cecil would clean the house, prepare meals. He would do the boys' homework with them, wash clothes. He was an all-around Mr. Mom.
Life in the Torrance household was better than ever, especially when Lisa was able to buy her family a new home.
She was living the American dream. She was married, she had a family, she had a beautiful home, she had nice cars in a driveway, bank account. Everyone looked at their life as a fairy tale.
And on June 4th, 2007, the family was thrilled to welcome a third son into the world. But what should have been a time for celebration became quite the opposite.
He was still not able to find work, and my career was just blossoming, and Cecil's not happy, arguing with me all the time about where I'm wanting to go, who I'm wanting to go with. His control was at an all-time high.
Lisa had been down this road before with disastrous consequences and was not about to do it again. But she had her family and her future to think about. So in 2008, Lisa went to work on herself.
I started going to the gym. I lost tons of weight. I decided I was going to go back to school to work towards getting my degree. My job's going well. I have my home. The boys are good. Everything is good besides my marriage.
By the summer of 2009, Lisa had found her stride, but Cecil didn't exactly embrace her newfound independence.
He's coming into bars where I told him I was gonna be, and he's making scenes. He's going through all of my social network applications.
That took a toll on her. She just basically got tired of being underneath his thumb.
I was not gonna allow him to control me any longer. I was done.
So on February 28th, 2010, Lisa packed up the kids and headed to her friend's house, bracing herself for Cecil's reaction. But surprisingly, a week later, Cecil called and agreed their marriage was over.
Cecil was very calm, and he said to me, I know that we're breaking up. I know that the marriage is done. He just wanted me to bring his children back home for these next couple days so that he could spend time with his boys before he actually had to leave the household. And I agreed to come back.
But Lisa made it very clear to Cecil she was there for the sake of the children, not for him.
When I came back, I was very cold, very withdrawn from him, and we weren't, really talking.
The following morning of March 4th, 2010, Lisa got her oldest boys off to school as usual.
I take my 2-year-old and I sit him on the bed, and I go into the bathroom. I put my cell phone on the counter, I take off my robe, and I get into the shower and I close the glass doors.
But nothing could have prepared Lisa for what would happen next.
Cecil comes in, closes the door behind him, he slides the glass door to the side, and he points a black handgun in my face.
If you have a story for Who the Bleep and would like to appear on the series, go to investigationdiscovery.com. On the morning of March 4th, 2010, Lisa Torrance was begging for her life as her husband Cecil pointed a gun in her face.
I'm scared. I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, he's gonna kill me.
Lisa was paralyzed by fear, knowing their 2-year-old son was in the next room.
Cecil pistol whipped me. And he shatters the shower glass doors, blood splattering everywhere.
Cecil pummeled his wife for the next 30 minutes until their toddler knocked on the door.
And he starts saying, "Mommy, Daddy, open the door." So I'm yelling, "Mommy loves you."
Heartbroken and focused on her children, Lisa pleaded with Cecil as a parent.
I said, "What about our kids? If I'm dead, what about our kids? I won't tell the police." And he says to me, "Are you crazy?" Then he shot me. I felt my left femur bone being shattered. And they shot me again. I'm yelling, "Please, oh my God, I'm in so much pain."
Cecil shot his wife 4 times before grabbing her cell phone and fleeing with their 2-year-old son. He had left the mother of his children to die, but Lisa was dead set on staying alive.
I said to myself, if you're gonna die, you're gonna die trying to live. So I managed to crawl out of the tub. I couldn't walk, so my leg was dangling. I crawled down the first flight of stairs. I was in so much pain, so much pain. And then I crawled down the second flight of stairs. At this point in time, I'm in and out of consciousness.
After dragging her mangled body out of the house, Lisa collapsed in her yard. Minutes later, her neighbor discovered her and called 911. With Lisa's life hanging by a thread, word of the horrific early morning attack started to spread.
Next thing I know, my cousin nudges me. He says, "Get up, wake up." And he said, he shot her. Cecil shot Lisa. And I ran out the room, repeating what he said. Cecil shot my sister. Cecil shot my sister. It killed me.
Lisa was rushed to the hospital while police searched for Cecil Torrance and their 2-year-old son.
There was no question they considered Cecil armed and extremely dangerous. There was concern over the safety of the children.
Police canvassed the area and discovered that Cecil had taken his youngest son to his mother's house before going into hiding.
When the police responded to Cecil's mother's house, their 2-year-old son was taken to the youth division of the Syracuse Police Department for safety, just in case Cecil had further contact with the mother.
While police pounded the pavement in search of Cecil, Lisa awoke from her 5-hour surgery to utter chaos.
My family members were coming in and they had tears in their eyes, and I have detectives in my room. I'm in the hospital under an alias. People are, scared for my children because they're afraid that he might try and come and kidnap them, maybe take them as a hostage.
I was scared. The hospital was on lockdown because they didn't want him to come in and try to finish the job.
After an exhaustive 30-hour manhunt, police received an anonymous tip about Cecil's whereabouts.
Cecil was apprehended at a friend's house. And the police found him hiding under a pile of clothes in a closet.
When I found out Cecil was arrested, I felt relieved. It felt like the boogeyman was gone. And with the help of God, I took everything in me and I fought hard for my life.
After 6 days in the hospital and 4 months in rehabilitation, Lisa made a full recovery. On February 14, 2011, Cecil Torrance pled guilty to second-degree attempted murder and was later sentenced to 18 years in jail.
I was happy. I knew that this was a start of a brand new Lisa, because I was one of the lucky ones. There's a lot of people who don't make it out.
Today, Lisa now recognizes Cecil for the troubled man that he was.
I never viewed myself as a victim because it was happening so far and few in between. No one could have never, ever told me that he would try and take my life from me.
It wasn't her time to go. She was determined to live. He just made her stronger.
Now Lisa volunteers with a local agency dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence.
I try and reach young kids who are going through things like that and get them to understand that, you know what, just because he says he loves you doesn't mean that he won't hurt you.
Ryan Burns was looking forward to a bright future with a picture-perfect lady.
Jody is attractive, very outgoing and intelligent. Good, girlfriend type material.
She was a beautiful girl. She had a great smile. Ryan was love-struck.
But little did he know behind her gorgeous smile was a monstrous plan.
It was like fatal attraction. She knew what she wanted and she wasn't going to give up until she got it.
A plan that would leave Ryan within arm's reach of pure evil.
She just really knew how to manipulate people.
It was so hard for me to believe that I might be talking to a killer.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Ryan Burns wanted what most smart, driven men in their early 20s want. A full-time job with a high salary doing something he loved, and a girl with whom to share the wealth.
After college, I was looking for something where I could have fun, help people, and make money, and need somebody that, I was a good match with. I was not aggressively looking for a serious relationship, but I was open to dating and meeting new people.
So in the fall of 2007, the ambitious Utah native focused on achieving his first goal, earning a good income with a company that helped people gain access to attorneys and legal counsel.
I knew that there was people making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with the company, so that's what intrigued me.
But by December of 2007, just a few months after he started as a sales associate, Ryan found himself struggling. So he decided to attend a local training meeting where one of the company's top executives named Travis was giving a motivational speech.
It was just amazing. Travis gave everything he had that night, and it definitely impacted me. I laughed, I cried, I could relate to him.
Moved by Travis's speech, Ryan worked up the courage to introduce himself and was very glad he did.
Travis made me feel like $1 million. He gave me some advice. And I left out of that training that night in those 2 hours inspired.
Something that Travis said just clicked with him, and from that point on, he was just successful and doing really well in the company.
Ryan was well on the way to the career of his dreams, but his love life was still lacking. That is, until March of 2008, when he attended his company's annual convention in Oklahoma City and spotted a stunning woman in the crowd.
She was a beautiful blonde girl. She was walking everywhere smiling, and she just seemed like somebody I wanted to definitely go and talk to.
So Ryan was shocked when the attractive blonde made a beeline straight for him.
She stuck out her hand and says, "Hi, I'm Jody." And I shook her hand, I said, "Hi, I'm Ryan," and she was just very forward.
Jody told Ryan she worked in the company's California office and was moving up the ranks to a director position. Ryan was instantly impressed.
She was an attractive woman. We had the business in common, which was great. She just seemed like somebody I'd be interested in getting to know.
The two exchanged numbers, and Ryan hoped this might be an opportunity to achieve both of his goals, professionally and romantically.
I was excited to be able to get her number and know that I could give her a call.
And a few weeks later, Ryan finally mustered up the courage.
We hit it off right away. We had just so much in common about the business and where we wanted to go in life. I had felt like I'd met, the coolest girl on the planet.
Soon, Jody and Ryan were spending hours on the phone every night. But during one late-night chat, Jody revealed she had once dated Ryan's co-worker, Travis.
I was surprised, but I didn't ask her much about Travis. She told me her and Travis broke up because of the trust. But he was a great guy.
Ryan didn't want to pry. Besides, he was truly enjoying his promising phone relationship with Jody. He only wished they lived closer.
She started kind of flirting with the idea of coming out and seeing me. So I was excited to spend some time with her and see if, we got along in, personal one-on-one basis.
So on June 3rd, Jody planned to leave California around 9 p.m. and drive straight through the night to Ryan's house.
She was going to call when she was leaving California. I felt like it was a huge step for somebody to drive 1,000 miles to come and see me. So I was excited.
But when 11 p.m. came and went with no word from Jody, Ryan started to worry.
I called her, she didn't answer, sent her a text around 10 or 11. She didn't answer that. I called her again at 1 and still going straight voicemail. That's when I started really kind of being concerned.
Jody's radio silence made Ryan fear the worst. And he would soon find out his instincts were dead on.
No one could have imagined what Jody was really doing at that time.
She's just evil all the way around.
I was sick to my stomach. She's a monster, a very manipulative monster.
On June 3rd, 2008, Ryan Burns was anxiously awaiting the arrival of his coworker and budding love interest, Jody. After 5 weeks of long-distance phone calls, she was finally driving from California to visit him in Salt Lake City, Utah. But when 24 hours passed without word from Jody, Ryan was beside himself.
I was concerned and I was sick to my stomach. Maybe she got cold feet. I don't know. Maybe she could be seriously hurt. There was definitely something wrong, and I didn't know what it could possibly be.
Finally, that evening, Jody called.
I was relieved. Because at least I knew she was alive. She told me that she got on the freeway in the middle of the night and it was dark and she drove the wrong direction.
Jody explained that her phone had died, and after finally getting back on course, she pulled over for a couple hours of sleep. But she promised to be there by morning. Finally, around 10 a.m. on June 5th, Jody and Ryan reunited in person.
I was just happy and excited. She got out of the car and came up and gave me a big hug and said she was so happy to see me.
But Ryan couldn't help noticing Jody's physical appearance.
First thing I noticed is her hair was not blonde. She had brunette hair. She was looking completely different. Then I noticed she had 2 little bandages on her hand. I said, "What happened to your hand? Are you okay?" And she basically said that she cut her hands on a margarita glass. She's kind of a klutz like that.
Ryan was excited for the chance to finally spend some alone time with Jody.
And we turned the movie on, and she just snuggled right up. She turned her head, and I leaned over, and I kissed her. It was just, a sweet kiss.
But before things got too heated, Jody announced it was time for her to leave. And the following day, Ryan already found himself missing her.
After she was here, I was more excited about the relationship. The very next conversation that we had, we discussed me going up there.
Ryan was on cloud 9, but when his coworkers saw him the next day, they seemed prepared to bring him back down to earth.
I didn't think Jody was a good match for Ryan. I knew that after she and Travis broke up, she had sent emails to girls that he was dating because she had broken into his email account.
They had somewhat of a tumultuous relationship. They had trust issues. I was nervous about Ryan dating her, and I didn't think it was a great idea.
Ryan didn't listen to any of it. He was, I guess you'd say, love-struck at the time.
They didn't give me any details. They just said, take my word for it. But I'm enjoying getting to know her, and so it didn't deter me. I just wanted to hear her side.
So on June 9th, during a 3-hour internet chat with Jody, Ryan broached the subject of the trust issues that had ultimately ended her relationship with Travis.
That's when she explained to me. She started going through Travis's phone. She saw that he was actually texting a few different girls, and she said, I was devastated. I couldn't believe that somebody I thought was in an exclusive relationship was dating other women.
Jody admitted she had broken into Travis's email account too, clearly ashamed and horrified, she'd stoop to such a low level.
I was surprised, but at the same time, I kind of admired her honesty and the fact that she was open about it and trusted the relationship we had built at that time.
But the next day, Ryan received a call from Jody, and even he wasn't prepared for the shocking words coming out of her mouth.
She was crying. I asked her if she was okay. And she said, "He's dead."
I was sick. You hardly can believe it's happening. It's surreal.
I was just so shocked. I thought, man, I might be talking to a killer.
On the morning of June 10th, 2008, Ryan Burns received a frantic phone call from his long-distance love interest, Jody.
She sounded upset. She was crying. She said, "He's dead. Travis is dead." I was just shocked by the news. I couldn't figure out what could have gone wrong. I thought it had to be a suicide, but Jody told me that the police, they're looking at it like a suspicious death and there was a lot of blood.
Ryan struggled to make sense of the news, all the while devastated that a man he looked up to, who was so full of life, was now dead.
I just don't understand how this could have happened. I felt bad for his family. I felt bad for Jody.
But Ryan's co-workers had different feelings and plenty of accusations. They made no attempt to hide their suspicions that Ryan's new love interest, Jody, was involved in Travis's untimely death.
I got a call from Clancy, and she said, "Did you hear the news?" And I said, "Yes." I talked to Jody, and Clancy immediately said, "Don't ever talk to that crazy bee again. Ryan, she killed him. I don't know how she did it, but I'm telling you right now, she did it."
Everyone that knew her and knew Travis suspected she killed him. I mean, I knew with every fiber in my being that it was her.
All of us knew down to our core that she was the one who had killed Travis, and Ryan didn't want to believe it.
I thought it was ridiculous that people would think that she could take Travis on, especially since the guy was athletic at 200 pounds, and Jody was 115, soaking wet. She was a tiny person.
And by all appearances, Jody was just as devastated as everyone else. She'd even assisted police.
Jody spoke to the detective, and she seemed to be cooperating in a normal way and wanted to help in any way she possibly could.
Still, when Jody mentioned 2 weeks later that she wanted to come back to Utah for a visit, Ryan felt torn.
I told her, "I would love for you to come to see me, but honestly, Jody, a lot of people here think you had something to do with Travis's murder, and it would be an extremely awkward time to come and visit me." And she acted shocked. You know, that was the first time she knew people were really suspicious of her.
Ryan quickly assured her once everything blew over, they'd be together. But it seemed things were about to blow up instead. On June 19th, police confirmed the date Travis was killed. A camera had been found inside Travis's home, hidden in a washing machine.
The sheets and a camera they found inside the washing machine had been bleached and had gone through a washing cycle. Police were able to go through it. There were photos that were still on the camera and some that someone had tried to delete. There were timestamps on the photos that showed him being murdered on June 4th, 2008.
When Ryan learned the date Travis was killed, all hopes of a future with Jody completely vanished.
That was mind-blowing information to me, because that means he did die the day that Jody was missing for 26 hours.
With a sick and twisted feeling in his stomach, Ryan's mind flashed back to their visit.
I started piling on the whole trail of inconsistencies, and that she had been missing for 26 hours and her phone was actually off, and the cuts on her hands and her hair being dyed. That's when I started to believe all the things that all my friends had been saying, that she probably had something to do with it. I knew that it was too big of a coincidence.
With only Travis on his mind, Ryan called the Mesa Police Department to tell them about his interactions with Jody.
I'm not going to try to condemn her. I'm not going to try to protect her. I'm just going to tell them exactly what happened, exactly what I knew.
Ryan hoped he had made the right decision. And soon, when the shocking details of Travis's death were made public, it became all too clear that he had.
It was a very grisly seeing a lot of blood.
The state that Travis was found in, it's horrific to think about what he went through.
And I just remember feeling sick to my stomach. It could only be conjured up in a horror movie.
If you have a story for Who the Bleep and would like to appear on the series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In July of 2008, Ryan Burns went to the police about his former love interest, Jody, who he suspected was involved in the murder of their co-worker, Travis Alexander.
The detective wanted to know about my relationship with her and her travel schedule on the 4th. So I told him how I couldn't get a hold of her. The fact that the detective was still asking questions about Jody, I knew that she was still definitely up there in the suspect list.
And as more details of the crime were uncovered, the entire nation was suddenly captivated. It turned out Travis hadn't just been murdered, he'd been completely brutalized.
Travis was found in the shower. He had been stabbed more than 20 times. He was shot in the head, and his throat was slit from ear to ear. This attack was horrific. It was a gruesome crime scene.
It was just unreal finding out how he was actually killed. I don't even know how to explain it. It was horrible.
Initially, Jody denied ever being at Travis's house on June 4th.
Were you at Travis's house on Wednesday?
Absolutely not. I was nowhere near Mesa.
Jody told police she was with Ryan Burns the entire time. She told investigators she drove to Utah on June 3rd, 2008 and stayed there until June 5th. Clearly, she was trying to use Ryan as an alibi.
But the photographs on the recovered camera proved otherwise.
There were photos of Jody and Travis being intimate. There were photos that Jody took of Travis while he was in the shower. From there, the crime started. You can see in the timestamp exactly when Jody started to kill Travis. You see Travis lying bloody on the floor. You see Jody's foot. You see a crime being committed before your eyes.
On the morning of July 15th, 2008, Jody Arias was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Travis Alexander.
I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe that I held in my arms a murderer who had just done that to another human being.
And as Ryan tried to come to grips with the truth, Jody decided to change her story, telling investigators she did visit Travis on June 4th, but she didn't kill him.
She told police that 2 masked intruders had broken into Travis's home and committed the crime, and that she was narrowly able to escape.
But when the police disproved that story, Jody claimed she killed Travis in self-defense.
They said there was no way that this was a likely story. If you are going to kill someone in self-defense, you're not going to stab them more than 20 times and shoot them and slit their throat.
It appeared Jody Arias was nothing but a professional liar, a femme fatale, and was possibly planning to kill again.
They found her with a 9mm, 2 knives, and she was going somewhere. I don't know where she was going and who she was going for, but she was going somewhere.
I got chills thinking, could she have really had that in mind to actually kill again? Could it have been me?
Ryan was eager for Jody's trial to start, but getting justice for Travis wasn't going to be a quick or easy process. It took more than 4 years before Jody had her day in court on January 2nd, 2013.
Jody just seemed to lack emotion. Anytime she cried, to everybody it felt like fake. It felt like a show for the jury. You'd think there'd be some emotion somewhere. She seemed so disconnected.
Finally, on May 8th, 2013, after 16 weeks of testimony, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder.
Find the defendant as to count 1, first-degree murder, guilty.
When I heard the conviction, I just felt a relief. She's not coming back into normal civilization ever again. I think it was premeditated. I think she knew what she was doing. I think if anybody deserves the death penalty, she deserves it.
Career success he always wanted, and he finally got the girl too.
I couldn't be happier right now with 2 beautiful children, beautiful wife. We have a great relationship.
It began. The highway outside the town limits was empty except for a single pair of headlights cutting through the Texas dark, a ribbon of asphalt humming under worn tires, the radio low, the air thick with late summer heat, and somewhere between mile marker 47 and a rusted cattle gate, something went wrong. Something so quiet and so fast that no one heard it happen, yet everyone would feel it for the next 20 years. Because this was the last confirmed sighting of a young woman who never made it home, and by morning her name would be spoken in whispers, her face printed on flyers, her absence already beginning to harden into a cold case. Texas in 2005 was a place that trusted routine, trusted neighbors, trusted that people went missing somewhere else. Not here. Not in a town where everyone recognized every truck by the sound of its engine and every stranger by the way they walked into the diner. But when the sun came up and her car was found abandoned on the shoulder, engine cold, driver's door ajar, purse still inside, that trust cracked. Because nothing about the scene made sense, and nothing about it felt accidental. The car sat angled toward the ditch as if pulled over in a hurry, no skid marks, no shattered glass, no sign of a struggle anyone could agree on. Just a faint scuff in the dirt, and a single shoe lying several feet away, its sole worn thin at the heel, a detail that would later haunt investigators because shoes don't fall off by themselves. Not like that. Not unless someone is running or being dragged or leaving in a way they never planned to. Her name spread faster than the facts, repeated on local radio, murmured in church pews, scribbled on missing posters taped to telephone poles, and each repetition sharpened the fear, because she wasn't reckless. She wasn't transient. She wasn't hiding from anything. She was local, known, predictable, the kind of person whose routines were so fixed that deviation felt like an alarm bell. And on that night, she had deviated once, just once, choosing a back road instead of the main highway. A decision that would be dissected endlessly, as if understanding that choice could somehow undo what followed. Law enforcement arrived before dawn, their flashlights cutting pale circles through the weeds, radios crackling softly, boots sinking into the soft ground, and from the very first hour the case carried a strange weight, the kind that settles in when evidence is scarce but stakes are high, when every footprint could matter and every passing car feels like a witness slipping away, and yet despite the urgency, the scene yielded almost nothing. No blood, no weapon, no clear direction of travel. Only absence, thick and undeniable. They canvassed nearby homes, knocked on doors while coffee brewed and alarm clocks rang, asked the same questions over and over. Did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Did you notice a car you didn't recognize? And the answers came back empty, a chorus of no's punctuated by uncertainty, by half-remembered sounds and vague impressions, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, a truck passing too fast to identify. The kind of fragments that feel important but refuse to lock into place. By midday, the town was buzzing, patrol cars lined the road, reporters hovered at the edges, and the word cold case had not yet been spoken, but it was already forming in the negative space between facts, in the realization that without a body, without a suspect, without a clear crime, time was already beginning its slow erosion of memory and certainty, grinding sharp details into smooth, unhelpful shapes. Search teams fanned out into fields and tree lines, combed creek beds, called her name into the heat until their voices went hoarse. Helicopters traced lazy circles overhead, and still there was nothing. No trace of where she had gone after stepping out of that car. No indication of whether she left willingly or under duress, and the longer the search went on, the heavier the silence became. Because silence in a missing person case is never neutral. It is accusatory. It points to what should be there and isn't. Friends described her last phone calls, mundane plans, casual laughter, no hint of fear, no coded goodbye, nothing that suggested she expected the night to end anywhere but her own bed, and investigators listened carefully, searching for cracks, for contradictions, for anything that might reframe the story, but all they found was normality, a life paused mid-sentence, unfinished and inexplicable. As days turned into weeks, the initial surge of activity slowed. Tips dried up, Leads circled back on themselves, and the case file thickened with paperwork but not with answers. And it was then that the first rumors began to take shape, because when official explanations run out, unofficial ones rush in to fill the gap. Stories about a strange truck seen near the highway, about an argument overheard days earlier, about a drifter passing through town at just the wrong time, each rumor carrying a charge of fear and accusation, each one demanding attention and then collapsing under scrutiny. The investigators followed what they could, interviewed who they could find, but nothing stuck. Alibis held, sightings contradicted each other, timelines blurred, and slowly, painfully, the case slid from the front page to the inside, from urgent bulletins to occasional updates, and finally into that uncomfortable category no one likes to name: unsolved, unresolved, a cold case in everything but label. Years passed, and the town changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. A new grocery store here, a closed gas station there, children who had once searched the fields growing up and moving away, but her absence remained fixed, a permanent gap in the collective memory, brought up every anniversary, every time a new face appeared on a missing poster, every time someone drove that stretch of road at night and slowed down without knowing why. Then, almost 2 decades later, the case came back, not with new evidence dug from the ground, not with a body discovered by chance, but with a confession, sudden and shocking, delivered not in a dramatic standoff but across a metal table in a small interview room, a man claiming responsibility for what had haunted the town for so long, his words spreading faster than any official statement, igniting hope and skepticism in equal measure, because confessions have a way of doing that, especially when they arrive so late. The news hit like a thunderclap. Texas, 2005 cold case reopened. Suspect confession shocks entire town, and for the first time in years, people leaned in again, asked questions again, felt that old tension tighten in their chests, because a confession promises closure, but it also threatens to rewrite everything, to challenge the assumptions that have calcified over time. And as investigators reopened boxes, reread notes, retrace steps, the past rushed back with startling clarity, reminding everyone that a cold case is never really cold. It is only waiting, patient and relentless, for the moment when silence breaks. In the days that followed, details dripped out slowly, carefully, as officials balanced transparency against the risk of contaminating a fragile investigation, and with each fragment, the story grew more complicated, because the confession did not align neatly with the known facts, because it raised as many questions as it answered, because some details rang true while others felt rehearsed, borrowed, or wrong. And the town found itself suspended between belief and doubt, caught in that uneasy space where justice feels close but not yet within reach. People drove past the old scene again, stood at the shoulder and looked into the dark, tried to imagine how it all unfolded, tried to map the confession onto the landscape they knew so well, and in doing so, they reopened wounds they thought had scarred over, realizing that closure is not a single moment but a process, messy and uncertain, especially when the truth has been buried under years of speculation and silence. For investigators, the reopening meant pressure, scrutiny, and the weight of expectation, because a confession can be a gift or a trap, and distinguishing between the two requires patience, skepticism, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable possibilities, including the chance that the real story is still hidden, still waiting to be told. And as the case moved forward once more, the town held its breath, aware that whatever came next would either finally answer the question that had lingered for so long, or deepen the mystery that had already defined a generation. The confession did not arrive alone. It dragged a shadow behind it, a long trail of doubts and contradictions that investigators felt immediately as they replayed the recording late into the night. The suspect's voice steady at first, then uneven, pausing in places where memory should have flowed, accelerating where caution might have been expected, and in those rhythms, detectives heard not resolution but tension, the unmistakable sound of a story still being tested against the truth. He was not a stranger pulled from nowhere, not a drifter or a name scraped from the margins of an old tip sheet. He was someone who had existed on the periphery of the case for years, close enough to be remembered, distant enough to be dismissed, a local man with a familiar face, the kind you pass at the hardware store without a second glance, and that familiarity made the confession land harder, because it collapsed the distance people rely on to feel safe. When word spread, the town reacted in fragments, disbelief whispered over kitchen tables, anger flaring in parking lots, a quiet, almost guilty relief among those who had carried the case like a personal burden, because a confession offers something seductive, the promise that the chaos of the past can finally be organized into a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But seasoned investigators know that narratives lie, that they smooth over jagged edges and hide inconvenient gaps. They went back to the evidence. What little there was, the abandoned car, the shoe, the scuffed dirt, the phone records frozen in time, and they laid the confession alongside it piece by piece, sentence by sentence, testing each claim against what had been documented years earlier, and almost immediately, inconsistencies surfaced, small at first, the wrong color of a vehicle, the wrong sequence of turns, details that could be chalked up to faded memory, except for the fact that some details were too precise, aligning uncannily with information that had never been made public. That tension between what he should not have known and what he claimed but could not verify became the center of the reopened investigation, a balancing act between skepticism and urgency, because if the confession was real, every hour mattered, but if it was false, chasing it could waste precious time and further entrench a lie, and the pressure mounted as media attention intensified. Cameras returning to the town like migratory birds, drawn by the scent of a story not yet finished. Investigators retraced the suspect's movements from 2005, reconstructed his routines, his job, his relationships, his habits, and what they found was a life that intersected with the victim's world in subtle, easily overlooked ways, shared roads, shared acquaintances, shared spaces where paths could cross without notice, and that overlap complicated everything, because it made opportunity plausible without making guilt certain. They interviewed old witnesses again, people now older, slower, more cautious with their words, memories softened by time, yet in some cases sharpened by years of private reflection, and as they spoke, new nuances emerged, a glance that felt wrong in hindsight, a noise dismissed as nothing at the time, details once considered irrelevant now re-examined under the harsh light of a possible confession, and still, nothing locked firmly into place. The suspect's account placed him at the roadside that night, claimed an encounter that escalated quickly, too quickly, he said, a moment of panic, a decision made in seconds, and investigators listened without interruption, letting the story breathe, because they knew that false confessions often reveal themselves not through what is said, but through what is avoided, through the emotional beats that fail to land, through an absence of sensory detail where trauma should have burned itself into memory. Yet there were moments in the recording that unsettled even the most skeptical, brief flashes of specificity, the smell of hot asphalt, the way insects sounded louder after the car door closed, the position of the moon, details that felt less like invention and more like recollection, and it was in those moments that the case tightened its grip, refusing to settle into a simple answer. Behind the scenes, forensic teams revisited old samples, technology now capable of extracting meaning from fragments once deemed useless, swabs reanalyzed, fibers re-examined, data reprocessed with tools that did not exist in 2005, and each test carried the weight of expectation, because science has become the modern myth of justice, the idea that truth can be pulled cleanly from evidence if only the right machine is applied. The town watched closely, reading between the lines of official statements, speculating in online forums and at bar counters, and the division grew sharper, some convinced that the confession was the long-awaited key, others warning that desperation can manufacture certainty where none exists, and that cold cases, by their nature, attract confessions the way gravity attracts debris, pulling in those seeking attention, absolution, or a distorted sense of control. Family members of the missing woman found themselves trapped in a familiar nightmare, hope rekindled but fragile, every new detail reopening grief they had learned to carry quietly, because a confession does not heal by itself, it only reactivates the wound, forcing them to imagine once more what might have happened on that dark stretch of road, to picture moments they had tried, unsuccessfully, to forget. As investigators pressed the suspect for clarification, timelines shifted subtly, details adjusted, explanations refined, and while some evolution is expected as memory is probed, too much flexibility can signal a narrative being shaped rather than recalled, and that possibility hung heavy in the room, unspoken but understood, as detectives exchanged glances, marking mental notes they would later translate into reports and diagrams. The case, once dormant, now pulsed with activity, yet despite the noise, the core mystery remained intact because the confession, dramatic as it was, did not produce the one thing everyone wanted, the location of the victim, and without that, without physical confirmation, the story could not be sealed, could not be closed, and the absence that had defined the case from the beginning continued to assert itself, stubborn and unresolved. Late at night, after interviews ended and offices emptied, detectives returned to the earliest reports, the raw notes taken in the hours after the disappearance, searching for something they might have missed, some small inconsistency that now, in light of the confession, took on new meaning, and in doing so, they confronted an uncomfortable truth that the case had never truly been inactive, it had been waiting, accumulating unanswered questions like pressure beneath a sealed lid. Outside the station, the town slept uneasily, lights flickering off one by one, the same roads stretching silently through the dark, unchanged and indifferent, and somewhere between belief and doubt, between the promise of closure and the fear of another dead end, the cold case breathed again, not solved, not finished, but undeniably awake, reminding everyone that reopening the past does not guarantee resolution. It only guarantees confrontation. As the investigation pressed forward, the confession began to fracture under its own weight, not collapsing outright, but developing hairline cracks that widened each time detectives returned to the roadside in their minds, replaying the night again and again, because real events, no matter how old, have a stubborn consistency, and invented ones tend to drift, especially when tested against the unyielding geometry of time and place. They drove the suspect along the same stretch of highway, windows down, engine humming, asking him to point out where it happened, where the car was stopped, where she stood, where he stood, and at first his gestures were confident, his fingers slicing the air with certainty, but as the miles passed, hesitation crept in, landmarks blurred, distances shrank and expanded, and the road, unchanged since 2005, seemed to resist his story, offering no confirmation, no recognition. Back at the station, maps were spread across tables, timelines pinned to boards, and each new reconstruction exposed subtle impossibilities, minutes that did not fit, movements that required impossible speed, choices that made little sense given what was known about the victim's habits and fears, and while none of these discrepancies alone were enough to dismiss the confession, together they formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. Meanwhile, another thread began to surface, pulled from the edges of the old file, a series of tips that had once seemed insignificant, too vague to pursue aggressively, now re-examined with fresh urgency, including repeated mentions of a different vehicle seen near the scene that night, a dark pickup with distinctive damage, a detail that had been noted, archived, and forgotten as years passed without follow-up. When detectives tracked down the original callers, some no longer lived in town, some barely remembered making the call, but a few recalled the image with startling clarity, the way the truck slowed near the abandoned car, the way it lingered before disappearing into the dark, and as these accounts were layered together, they formed a silhouette that did not match the confession's narrative, introducing the possibility of another presence, another actor whose role had never been fully explored. The reemergence of that lead unsettled the investigation because it suggested that the confession might be incomplete, or worse, opportunistic, a story crafted around public knowledge while omitting a critical truth, and detectives found themselves juggling two competing realities, one anchored to a man who claimed guilt, the other to a shadowy figure who had never been identified. Pressure mounted from every direction, From media demanding answers, from the community desperate for resolution, from internal voices warning against tunnel vision, because cold cases are littered with examples of investigators locking onto a single explanation too tightly, mistaking momentum for proof, and repeating mistakes that only time makes visible. Forensic results trickled in slowly, deliberately, each test a reminder that science does not move at the pace of public expectation, and when preliminary findings failed to decisively support the confession, the mood shifted again, optimism tempered by caution, excitement dulled by the realization that reopening a case does not guarantee clarity. It often reveals how much uncertainty has accumulated in the dark. The suspect, sensing the shift, adjusted his tone, his demeanor alternating between cooperation and defensiveness, moments of apparent remorse punctuated by flashes of irritation, and detectives noted these changes carefully, aware that stress reveals character in unpredictable ways, sometimes illuminating truth, sometimes masking it behind performance. In parallel, attention returned to the victim herself, to details of her life that had been overshadowed by years of speculation, her relationships, her routines, her unspoken tensions, because understanding who she was and what she feared could illuminate why she might have stopped on that road, why she might have trusted, or resisted, or run, and in those quieter inquiries, investigators uncovered hints of unease, minor conflicts, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest that her disappearance did not occur in a vacuum. As these fragments accumulated, the case grew denser, less linear, resisting the simplicity of a single confession, and detectives began to speak cautiously, choosing words that acknowledged progress without promising closure, because they understood that the most dangerous moment in a cold case is when certainty feels close but remains unearned. The town sensed the hesitation, read it between the lines, and the initial shock gave way to a more complicated emotion, a wary vigilance, because hope that rises too quickly can fall just as hard, and many residents had learned, painfully, not to trust headlines alone. Night after night, the same stretch of road lay silent, illuminated briefly by passing headlights, the scene of a mystery still unresolved, and in that silence, the questions persisted, louder than any confession, insisting that truth does not announce itself. It must be extracted, piece by piece, from a past that has learned how to hide. With the confession no longer commanding the center unchallenged, investigators widened their lens, allowing the case to breathe outward instead of collapsing inward, and in doing so they returned to a principle drilled into them years ago, that cold cases rarely hinge on a single dramatic act. They unravel through accumulation, through the slow alignment of small, stubborn facts that refuse to disappear. They revisited the night itself with forensic precision, reconstructing weather patterns, moon phases, traffic flow, the subtle variables that shape human behavior without announcing themselves, and what emerged was a more complex picture of opportunity and risk, a stretch of road that was not as isolated as memory suggested, a night warmer, brighter, more active than the narrative of total darkness had implied. Traffic cameras from distant intersections, once dismissed as irrelevant, were reviewed again, not for the impossible hope of capturing the crime, but for context, for patterns, for the rhythm of movement through the area in the hours before and after the disappearance. And in that data, investigators noticed anomalies, vehicles passing when they should not have, gaps where continuity broke, moments that resisted easy explanation. Phone records were scrutinized with equal care, not just the victims' calls, but those of people connected to the area, triangulating towers, mapping proximity, building a lattice of digital footprints that, while incomplete, suggested overlaps that had never been fully appreciated, because in 2005, data had been gathered but not yet understood in the way it is now. One overlap, subtle but persistent, drew renewed attention, a pattern of movement that placed another individual near the scene around the same time, someone whose name appeared briefly in the original file and then vanished into the administrative fog of an overloaded investigation. A reminder that early chaos can bury leads that only clarity can exhume. As detectives followed that thread, they encountered resistance, not overt, but quiet, the kind that comes from people who have lived with a secret long enough to mistake it for safety. interviews marked by evasive language, selective memory, and an insistence on normalcy that felt rehearsed, and while none of it rose to the level of proof, it added texture to a case that had long felt flat. The suspect's confession was revisited in this new context, not discarded, but reframed, examined as one element among many rather than the keystone it had briefly seemed to be, and when placed alongside emerging evidence, its limitations became clearer. The way it avoided certain intersections of time and place, the way it explained the beginning but not the end, the encounter but not the aftermath. Media narratives struggled to keep pace with this complexity, oscillating between certainty and doubt, amplifying fragments without context, and in doing so, they reignited the town's anxiety, because ambiguity is harder to live with than accusation, harder to explain to children, harder to reconcile with the desire for justice that feels tangible and complete. For the family, the renewed investigation became a test of endurance, each call from detectives carrying both promise and dread, each headline reopening wounds that had never fully healed, because the passage of time does not soften loss, it only teaches people how to carry it more quietly. Investigators, aware of this weight, moved carefully, resisting the temptation to declare progress prematurely, because they had seen too many cases collapse under the strain of public expectation, had watched truth bend to fit a story rather than the other way around, and they were determined not to repeat that mistake. Behind closed doors, debates grew sharper, theories collided, timelines were redrawn and erased, and the case took on the messy, human shape it had lacked for years, full of doubt, disagreement, and the uneasy recognition that the simplest explanation is not always the correct one. The road itself remained unchanged, a constant amid shifting interpretations, its surface worn smooth by years of traffic, its shoulders overgrown, and investigators returned to it often, standing where the car had been found, listening to the night sounds, trying to reconcile memory with reality, because place is a way of revealing truths that paper cannot. As weeks passed without definitive answers, the initial surge of hope settled into a more sober determination, a recognition that reopening a cold case is not a sprint, but a marathon, and that the real work begins after the headlines fade, when only persistence remains. In that persistence, the case continued to evolve, no longer defined by a single confession, but by a growing constellation of unanswered questions, each one pulling the investigation forward, deeper into a past that refused to stay buried, insisting, quietly but relentlessly, that the truth was still out there, waiting to be confronted. Time began to distort the investigation in subtle ways, not by slowing it down, but by forcing everything to coexist at once, the past pressing against the present, old interviews replayed alongside new ones, voices separated by decades colliding in the same rooms, and detectives felt that disorientation keenly, because solving a cold case means living in two timelines simultaneously, never fully belonging to either. The reopened file expanded rapidly, new notes layered over yellowed pages, digital transcripts stacked against handwritten margins, and within that sprawl, patterns emerged that had been invisible before, connections too faint to register in 2005 now glowing with significance, because meaning often depends on context, and context had finally arrived. One pattern centered on proximity, not just physical closeness to the scene, but emotional and social proximity to the victim, people who shared routines, spaces, obligations, whose presence in her life had once seemed benign, unremarkable, and investigators began to question whether familiarity itself had been the camouflage, whether the danger had worn a face no one thought to fear. Old co-workers were interviewed again, their recollections tentative, shaped by years of hindsight, and among their memories were moments that had once felt trivial, a disagreement brushed aside, an uncomfortable interaction rationalized away, and as these moments resurfaced, they added a low, unsettling hum to the narrative because they suggested tension beneath the surface, subtle, easy to miss, but persistent. At the same time, the roadside scene was reinterpreted through this lens, the lack of violence, the absence of chaos, The shoe left behind not as evidence of a struggle, but perhaps of interruption, of a moment when control shifted unexpectedly, and that reframing challenged assumptions that had guided the early investigation, assumptions born of urgency rather than understanding. The confession, still looming, began to feel less like an answer and more like a symptom, an event triggered by the reopening itself, by the renewed attention, by the pressure that comes when the past is dragged back into the light, and investigators considered the uncomfortable possibility that it had been shaped by knowledge gained over years of rumor and speculation, a narrative assembled from pieces floating freely in the community. They tested this theory carefully, probing the suspect's awareness of details that had never been released, separating what could have been learned from what could only have been experienced, and while some answers held firm, others wavered, and in those wavering moments, detectives saw the outline of a story still under construction. The town's reaction shifted again, fatigue settling in where excitement had once flared, because prolonged uncertainty exacts a toll of its own, people growing tired of hoping, tired of debating, tired of reopening old fears, and yet unable to look away, because the case had become part of the town's identity, a shared wound that defined generations. Anonymous tips increased, the byproduct of renewed attention, phones lighting up with calls that ranged from earnest to unhinged, each one requiring evaluation, each one carrying the faint possibility of truth, and investigators sifted through them methodically, aware that among the noise, a signal might still be hiding. Some tips contradicted each other outright, others echoed long-dismissed rumors, but a few introduced new names, new locations, new questions, and those were pursued quietly, deliberately, without the fanfare that had accompanied the confession, because investigators had learned that the loudest developments are not always the most meaningful. In the background, legal considerations began to surface, prosecutors advising caution, reminding everyone that a case reopened is not a case solved, that evidence must not only exist but withstand scrutiny, and that the passage of time erodes more than memory. It erodes admissibility, credibility, and the margin for error. For the family, patience became a form of endurance, waiting for calls that might never come, measuring progress in half-statements and careful language, and living once more with the knowledge that closure, if it comes at all, may arrive in fragments rather than a single, definitive moment. Investigators, feeling the weight of these expectations, returned again to the fundamental question that had haunted the case from the beginning, not who confessed, not who speculated, but what actually happened on that road, and as they asked it again and again, stripping away narratives that no longer fit, the mystery sharpened rather than softened. Because the more they learned, the clearer it became that the disappearance was not the product of chance alone, nor of a single, impulsive act, but of a convergence of circumstances, decisions, and omissions, some visible, some hidden, all of them entwined in a way that resisted simple explanation. And so the cold case pressed on, no longer defined by dormancy, but by motion, by the relentless pursuit of clarity in a landscape crowded with shadows, each step forward revealing not an ending, but a deeper, more unsettling understanding of how easily a life can vanish, and how stubbornly the truth can refuse to surface. As momentum carried the investigation deeper, a new tension surfaced, quieter than headlines but far more dangerous, the tension between discovery and consequence, because every new thread pulled from the past threatened to unravel lives that had been carefully stitched back together, and detectives understood that truth, when delayed, does not arrive gently, it crashes into the present with accumulated force. Attention turned to relationships that had once seemed peripheral, connections logged and filed without urgency in 2005, now re-examined with a colder eye, and among them was a name that kept resurfacing, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, appearing at the edges of timelines, in phone records, in casual mentions by witnesses who had never thought their observations mattered. This individual had never been a suspect, had never been confronted directly, but proximity followed them like a shadow, proximity to the road, proximity to the victim's routine, proximity to moments that now felt charged with meaning, and investigators felt the familiar tightening in their chests, the instinct that signals a story is beginning to take shape even before its outline is clear. They approached carefully, knowing that years of silence can harden into reflex, interviews conducted with patience, questions framed gently at first, then more precisely, and what they encountered was a wall of normalcy, a life presented as orderly, predictable, untouched by the chaos of the case. Yet beneath that surface, inconsistencies flickered, small hesitations, answers that arrived a beat too late. These were not confessions, not even admissions, but they were deviations, moments where the script slipped, and detectives documented them meticulously because in cold cases, deviation is currency. It is how truth signals its presence without announcing itself outright. Parallel to these interviews, forensic teams revisited the physical evidence once more, pushing technology to its limits, extracting microscopic traces from items that had been handled, moved, stored for years. And while results remained frustratingly inconclusive, they narrowed possibilities, ruled out scenarios that had once seemed plausible, forcing the investigation down fewer, sharper paths. The confession, now aging rapidly under scrutiny, lost its gravitational pull, no longer the center around which everything revolved, but a satellite, still relevant, still unexplained, yet insufficient on its own, and investigators began to suspect that it might represent not the crime itself, but an attempt to insert oneself into its narrative, a claim shaped by guilt of a different kind, or by the desire to control an ending that had never belonged to them. Media interest waned slightly as the story grew more complex, less suitable for clean headlines, and in that quieting, investigators found space to work, freed from the constant demand for updates, able to follow leads without the pressure of immediate public interpretation. The town, meanwhile, absorbed the uncertainty in its own way, conversations softer now, more cautious, names spoken less freely, because as suspicion shifted from the abstract to the familiar, people felt the unease of recognizing themselves in the margins of the story, realizing that the line between witness and participant can blur over time. Late one evening, a tip arrived that did not announce itself as significant, a brief call, a halting voice, a memory triggered by recent coverage, and while the details were fragmented, they aligned unsettlingly with the emerging pattern, placing someone previously overlooked in a position that demanded attention, and detectives felt that electric jolt that comes when disparate threads begin to converge. They followed up quietly, verifying what could be verified, discarding what could not, and as the picture sharpened, it became clear that the disappearance might have involved more than one decision, more than one moment where things could have gone differently, a sequence of actions rather than a single catastrophic event. This reframing altered everything because it suggested that the mystery was not hidden behind a single locked door, but scattered across time, concealed in ordinary choices that only later revealed their weight, and investigators adjusted accordingly, reconstructing not just the night itself, but the days leading up to it, the subtle shifts in routine, the signals that had gone unnoticed. For the family, updates arrived cautiously, delivered without promise, and each one carried a strange duality, comfort in knowing the case was alive, pain in realizing how much had been missed, how many opportunities for intervention had slipped by unnoticed, and yet they listened, because listening was all they could do. As the investigation pressed forward, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Not the inevitability of resolution, but of reckoning, the understanding that whatever truth emerged would challenge long-held assumptions, force difficult conversations, and alter the way the town remembered itself. The road remained unchanged, stretching through the dark as it always had, but now it felt different, heavier, as if the accumulated weight of scrutiny had altered its character, and investigators knew that somewhere along that asphalt, the answers still waited, not hidden, not erased, just patient, resisting discovery until the right questions were finally asked. The closer the investigation moved toward clarity, the more fragile everything became, because clarity threatens balance, and balance, even when built on uncertainty, is something communities learn to protect, and detectives felt that resistance now, not as obstruction, but as tension in the air, a subtle closing of ranks as questions edged too near to home. Interviews grew more difficult, not because people refused to talk, but because they spoke carefully, measuring words, Weighing consequences, the casual openness of early conversations replaced by something more guarded, and that shift told investigators as much as any statement ever could, because innocence rarely calculates its own exposure. They returned again to the timeline of the victim's final day, not searching for drama, but for deviation, the smallest departures from routine, a delayed errand, a missed call, a brief stop that had never been documented, and in that granular reconstruction, they found a narrow window of time that had never been fully explained, a gap small enough to dismiss, large enough to matter. Within that gap, new possibilities emerged, interactions that could have occurred without witnesses, choices that could have been made under pressure, and detectives realized that the disappearance might not have been triggered by the roadside encounter at all, but by something set in motion earlier, something that followed her there rather than meeting her by chance. This idea unsettled the remaining assumptions, because it reframed the abandoned car not as the beginning of the story, but as its visible rupture, the moment when a private sequence of events spilled into public space, and that distinction mattered, because it expanded the circle of relevance, pulling in people and places previously considered unrelated. As this theory took shape, attention shifted to movements before the highway, to who knew her route, who could have anticipated her choice of road, who might have followed without raising alarm, and investigators sifted through years of overlooked data with renewed focus, patterns emerging where randomness had once been assumed. The confession, when viewed through this lens, felt increasingly out of place, a narrative anchored to the roadside but disconnected from the deeper currents now coming into view, and detectives began to treat it less as an account of events and more as an artifact of the case itself, a reflection of its notoriety rather than its truth. Quietly, without announcement, resources were redirected, surveillance conducted, records requested, past behaviors scrutinized for consistency, and in these quieter efforts, progress finally began to feel tangible, not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but real, the kind that accumulates slowly and resists simplification. The town noticed the change without understanding it, a subtle withdrawal of visible activity paired with an undercurrent of unease, because silence after noise can feel ominous, and many sensed that the investigation had moved into a phase where conclusions, whatever they might be, were being tested behind closed doors. For some, this provoked fear, for others, a cautious hope, and for a few, an instinct to distance themselves from the past, to avoid questions, to let old connections fade quietly, and detectives recognized these reactions for what they were, human responses to the possibility of exposure. Late one night, as files were cross-referenced and timelines refined, a realization settled in, heavy and undeniable, that the case had not stagnated because of a lack of effort, but because its true shape had been misunderstood, its complexity flattened by the need for a single culprit, a single moment, a single explanation. Now, with that constraint loosened, the story expanded, revealing layers of interaction, motive, and opportunity that did not align neatly, but together formed a more honest, more unsettling picture of how the disappearance could have unfolded. Investigators felt the weight of this shift personally, knowing that complexity makes justice harder, not easier, because it demands patience, nuance, and the courage to resist convenient answers, and yet they pressed on, driven by the sense that they were finally asking the right questions. The road, the car, the shoe, all the symbols that had defined the case for so long, receded slightly in importance, not erased, but contextualized, pieces of a larger mosaic rather than the frame itself, and in that recontextualization, the cold case took on a new life, less dramatic, more dangerous, because it edged closer to truths that could not be easily contained. As the investigation moved forward in this quieter, sharper phase, one thing became clear. Whatever happened on that Texas road in 2005 was not an isolated act of violence frozen in time, but the visible outcome of decisions made earlier, choices intersecting in ways that no one had recognized until now. And as that understanding settled in, the question was no longer whether the case could be solved, but whether the truth, once uncovered, would be something the town was ready to face. As the investigation crossed into this new phase, certainty became dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it tempted everyone to stop listening, and detectives resisted that temptation by doing the one thing that had been missing for years. They listened harder, not just to statements, but to silences, to patterns of avoidance, to the spaces where answers should have been. They began aligning timelines not by events, but by opportunities, mapping who could have known what, and when, tracing the quiet flow of information through the town like an underground current, because disappearances rarely occur in isolation. They occur in ecosystems of awareness, where someone always knows more than they say. Old friendships were reconsidered, casual favors reinterpreted, moments of kindness reframed as access, and in this re-examination, investigators found a troubling consistency, that the people closest to the unanswered questions were not the loudest voices, but the calmest, the ones who had never pushed for resolution, who had accepted uncertainty with suspicious ease. Records revealed subtle coordination, phone calls placed minutes apart, routes taken that mirrored each other too closely to be coincidence, and while none of this constituted proof, together it suggested choreography rather than chaos, a sequence shaped by intention rather than panic, and that distinction changed everything. The idea that the disappearance may have involved planning, however limited, forced investigators to confront the possibility of complicity, not necessarily in violence, but in concealment, the small decisions to delay, to omit, to normalize something that should have triggered alarm, because concealment often begins not with malice, but with fear. As these theories solidified, detectives revisited statements given years earlier, reading them aloud, listening for rhythm and phrasing, comparing them to present-day interviews, and in those comparisons, they detected drift, not just in memory, but in emphasis, certain details growing louder, others fading inexplicably, as if selectively adjusted to maintain a fragile consistency. The confession, now distant but still unresolved, lingered like static, interfering with clarity without providing resolution, and investigators began to suspect it had served an unintended purpose, diverting attention just long enough for deeper truths to remain obscured, because distraction, even accidental, can be powerful when timing is right. Behind the scenes, legal counsel urged restraint, reminding the team that implication is not evidence, that patterns suggest but do not convict, and that the danger of a reopened cold case is not failure, but overreach, the temptation to force coherence onto ambiguity. This caution slowed progress, but it also sharpened it, every move now deliberate, every inquiry justified, because the goal was no longer momentum, it was integrity, ensuring that whatever conclusion emerged would endure beyond the surge of attention that had resurrected the case. The town felt this shift as a tightening rather than a release, conversations growing quieter, fewer names spoken aloud, because people sensed that speculation was giving way to scrutiny, and scrutiny has a way of turning inward. For the family, updates became rarer but heavier, delivered with careful phrasing, heavy pauses, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the truth, whatever it was, might complicate grief rather than resolve it, because answers can wound as deeply as they heal. Investigators returned once more to the physical artifacts of the case, not expecting revelation, but grounding, reminding themselves that beneath the theories and patterns lay a single human absence, a life interrupted, and that grounding mattered, because it anchored the work to its purpose. Standing again on the roadside, they noticed how ordinary it felt, how easily it blended into the landscape, and that ordinariness became its own kind of answer, a reminder that extraordinary harm often occurs in unremarkable places, hidden not by darkness, but by familiarity. As files closed for the night and offices emptied, the case remained open in every sense of the word, unresolved but no longer static, its shape clearer even as its ending remained elusive, and in that uneasy clarity, investigators understood that the truth was no longer buried in the past, it was embedded in the present, waiting for the final resistance to give way. The resistance did not break all at once. It thinned, frayed at the edges, weakened by time and pressure until cracks appeared where none had been visible before, and investigators recognized those cracks not as victories, but as warnings, because when long-held silence begins to fail, what escapes is rarely clean or complete. A routine follow-up interview produced the first real shift, not through confrontation, but through fatigue, a witness who had repeated the same story for years, pausing too long before answering, correcting themselves mid-sentence, offering an explanation where none had been requested, and in those small deviations, detectives heard something new, not confession, but fear. They let the moment breathe, resisted the instinct to press too hard, because pressure closes doors as often as it opens them, and when they returned days later, the tone had changed, the witness less certain, less polished, admitting to gaps in memory they had previously denied, acknowledging conversations they had once dismissed as irrelevant, and while these admissions stopped short of revelation, they shifted the ground beneath the case. Those conversations pointed back to the same narrow window of time. The gap investigators had been circling for weeks, and within that gap, the shape of an interaction became clearer, an encounter that may not have been violent at first, may not have been intended to end the way it did, and that possibility complicated everything, because it blurred the line between accident and intent, between culpability and catastrophe. The notion that the disappearance could have resulted from a series of escalating misjudgments rather than a single malicious act forced detectives to confront uncomfortable legal realities, because justice systems are built to respond to clear narratives, and this case was shedding clarity even as it revealed truth. As they reconstructed this emerging sequence, attention returned to what happened after the roadside moment, the hours that followed, the decisions made when panic set in, and here the investigation encountered its most stubborn silence, because concealment thrives in the aftermath, not the act itself, in the choices to delay reporting, to move evidence, to normalize the abnormal. Records from that night were scrutinized again, service logs, fuel receipts, security footage from businesses miles away, anything that could anchor time to movement, and slowly, painstakingly, a secondary timeline took shape, one that diverged sharply from the confession's account and suggested activity well after the victim vanished from public view. This timeline implicated no single person definitively, but it implied coordination, or at least awareness shared across more than one individual, and that implication cast a long shadow, because it suggested that the case had remained unsolved not because of a lack of clues, but because those clues had been distributed across people who each held only a fragment, none willing to assemble the whole. When investigators began testing this theory in interviews, reactions varied, some defensive, some genuinely confused, others disturbingly calm, and it was that calm that unsettled the team most, because calm in the face of renewed scrutiny can signal resignation rather than innocence. The confession, once again reconsidered, now appeared in a different light, not as a false solution, but as interference, intentional or otherwise, a narrative that had absorbed attention at a critical moment, delaying the pursuit of a more complex truth, and detectives questioned whether that delay had been accidental or exploited. Publicly, officials remained cautious, releasing nothing that could compromise the fragile progress, and this silence fueled speculation, forums buzzing with theories, names recycled, accusations sharpened, and the town found itself once again living inside the case, measuring daily interactions against an unspoken question: who knows more than they say? For the family, the lack of clear updates became agonizing, because ambiguity feels cruel when hope has been reintroduced, and yet they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that premature certainty could destroy what little chance remained for real answers. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed outwardly but accelerated inwardly, fewer visible actions masking deeper analytical work, and detectives felt the weight of nearing something irreversible, because once a theory hardens into action, there is no returning to uncertainty. Late one night, reviewing transcripts side by side, a pattern crystallized, a shared phrase, an identical description used years apart by different people, something too specific to be coincidence, and in that moment, the room went quiet, because patterns like that do not emerge by chance. They surface when stories have been quietly aligned over time. That realization did not bring relief. It brought dread, because it suggested that the truth, when finally articulated, would not be clean, would not offer a single villain or a single mistake, but a chain of choices that implicated silence itself as an accomplice. The cold case, once defined by absence, now felt crowded with presence, with voices, with implications, with lives intersecting in ways no one had wanted to acknowledge, and as investigators prepared to move forward, they understood that solving the mystery would not restore what was lost. It would only expose how deeply the loss had been woven into the fabric of the town. Waiting all these years for someone to finally pull the thread. By the time the investigation reached this point, there was no turning back, because the pattern once seen could not be unseen, and every file, every statement, every quiet denial now bent toward the same uneasy gravity, pulling the case away from speculation and toward consequence. Detectives moved carefully, aware that the next steps would define the outcome, not just legally, but morally, because what they were confronting was not a single act frozen in time, but a collective failure stretched across years, sustained by omission, fear, and the unspoken agreement that silence was safer than truth. They began isolating fragments of testimony, removing them from their original context, comparing them not by content, but by cadence, by phrasing, by the emotional weight carried in specific words, and the similarities were impossible to ignore, the same justifications, the same minimizations, the same careful framing that positioned events as unfortunate rather than unacceptable. This linguistic alignment pointed toward coordination, not necessarily premeditated, but reactive, a shared understanding that emerged in the aftermath, when the realization set in that something had gone irreversibly wrong, and that the only way forward was together, quietly, without drawing attention. Investigators reconstructed that aftermath in painstaking detail, hour by hour, imagining the panic, the frantic calculations, the choices made under pressure, and what emerged was a scenario defined less by cruelty than by fear, fear of consequences, fear of exposure, fear of destroying lives already built, and that fear, once activated, became the engine of concealment. The confession, when placed within this reconstruction, finally made sense, not as a lie, not as truth, but as displacement, a story that absorbed guilt without touching the core of responsibility, a narrative that allowed others to remain untouched, unnamed, unexamined, and detectives questioned whether that displacement had been encouraged, subtly or explicitly, by those with the most to lose. Behind closed doors, legal discussions intensified because the path forward was narrowing and each option carried risk. Charging too early could collapse the case. Waiting too long could allow it to die again, and prosecutors emphasized what investigators already knew, that cold cases are won not by certainty, but by proof that survives resistance. The town sensed the shift, even without details, an unease settling into daily routines, conversations shortening, eyes lingering a little longer than usual, because when a mystery transitions from abstract to imminent, people feel it, even if they cannot articulate why. For some, this unease triggered confession-adjacent behavior, not admissions of guilt, but attempts at justification, stories offered unsolicited, explanations volunteered without prompt, and detectives recognized these as stress responses, signals that the pressure was no longer theoretical. They documented everything, knowing that truth often reveals itself through excess, through the need to explain what has not been asked, and in these explanations, they found more confirmation of the emerging theory that the disappearance had been followed by a collective decision to do nothing, to wait, to hope the problem would dissolve with time. Time, however, had done the opposite, preserving the absence, sharpening it, and now, with the case reopened, it demanded repayment, interest compounded by years of silence, and investigators felt the weight of delivering that reckoning responsibly. The family was briefed more directly than before, not with promises, but with honesty, told that the case was no longer stalled, but complicated, that progress had revealed truths that were difficult to summarize, and that any resolution would likely feel incomplete, because justice delayed rarely arrives whole. They listened, exhausted but resolute, because for them, even partial truth was preferable to endless speculation, and their endurance became a quiet anchor for the investigation. A reminder of why precision mattered, why shortcuts would betray the very purpose of reopening the case. As preparations were made for the next phase, subpoenas drafted, timelines finalized, interviews scheduled with a new urgency, investigators paused briefly, aware that they were standing at the threshold of something irreversible, a point where questions would turn into actions, and actions into consequences. The cold case, once defined by its stillness, now vibrated with potential energy, every file humming with implication, every silence heavy with meaning, and as the machinery of accountability began to turn, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever happened next would not restore the past, it would redefine it, and the town, whether ready or not, would have to live with what finally came to light. The final phase did not arrive with sirens or handcuffs. It arrived with restraint, with files sealed again, interviews concluded without announcement, and a careful quiet that settled over the town like dust after a long, exhausting storm, because some endings do not announce themselves, they simply stop moving. Subpoenas were served, questions asked, answers recorded. And yet what emerged was not the clean convergence everyone had imagined, but a boundary, a line beyond which certainty could not pass, because time had done its work too well, erasing edges, softening facts, granting plausible doubt to those who had waited long enough. Investigators assembled their findings into a narrative strong enough to explain, but not strong enough to indict, a reconstruction that clarified how the disappearance could have unfolded, how silence could have sustained it, how fear could have spread responsibility so thin that no single act stood alone, and in that fragmentation, the case reached its most painful truth, that knowing what happened is not the same as proving it. The confession, once explosive, now sat inert in the file, contextualized, diminished, no longer false, no longer sufficient, a relic of the case's long shadow, and its presence served as a reminder of how easily stories form around absence, how readily people offer themselves to mystery when truth remains just out of reach. Officials spoke carefully in their final statements, acknowledging progress without declaring victory, confirming that the cold case had been reopened, examined, and advanced, but stopping short of closure, because closure implies finality, and this case resisted it at every turn. The town absorbed this outcome unevenly, some angry, some resigned, some quietly relieved, because unresolved truth allows different people to carry different versions of the past, and not everyone wants those versions challenged, especially when the cost of certainty feels too high. For the family, the ending was not an ending at all, but a narrowing, the field of possibilities reduced, the wildest theories stripped away, replaced by a more intimate, more painful understanding that what happened did not come from nowhere. It grew from familiarity, from ordinary choices made by ordinary people, and that knowledge, while incomplete, carried its own weight. They returned once more to the roadside, not for answers, but for grounding, standing where the car had been found, where the story had first broken into the open, and in the quiet, they felt the absence that had defined 2 decades, unchanged by investigation, immune to explanation. The road continued to do what roads do, carry traffic, disappear into the distance, indifferent to the stories projected onto it, and that indifference became its own kind of testimony, a reminder that places do not remember, people do. Investigators closed their binders knowing the case might never leave their minds, that some questions would remain permanently suspended, not because they lacked curiosity, but because the past had been given too much time to protect itself, and in that protection, truth had learned how to hide. The headline faded from memory. Texas 2005 cold case reopened. Suspect confession shocks entire town, replaced by quieter conversations, fewer words, longer pauses, and the understanding that shock is temporary, but uncertainty endures. Years from now, someone will still slow down on that stretch of highway, glance at the shoulder without knowing why, feel a flicker of unease they cannot explain, and that is how the case will persist, not in court records or press releases, but in instinct, in the sense that something unresolved still lingers in the dark. Because some cold cases are not solved, they are absorbed, folded into the identity of a place, becoming a silent reference point, a reminder of how easily a life can vanish, how stubbornly truth can resist capture, and how silence, once chosen, can echo longer than any confession ever could. The story did not end where the file stopped. It thinned out, stretched forward into ordinary days, into routines that looked unchanged from the outside but carried a new, permanent tension beneath them, because when a cold case closes without resolution, it does not disappear. It disperses, settling into habits, glances, pauses, and the unspoken understanding that some truths live only as shared suspicion. Investigators moved on to other work, other files, other names, yet the case followed them in quieter ways, resurfacing in idle moments, in comparisons they never intended to make, in the reflex to question neat explanations, because once you have watched a mystery survive decades, you stop believing that time naturally delivers justice. The town adjusted as towns do, not through dramatic change, but through accommodation, learning where not to look, which questions not to ask, which anniversaries to mark privately rather than publicly, and over time, the case became less a topic of conversation and more a presence, like an old scar you no longer touch but always feel. New families moved in, unaware of the full history, driving the same road without context, while longtime residents measured distance differently, counting not miles but memories, knowing exactly where the car had been found, exactly where the search lines once formed, exactly where the story crossed from rumor into something personal. Occasionally, a new tip would surface, a memory jogged by age or regret, and investigators would listen, because listening costs little and sometimes yields everything, but most of these tips dissolved under scrutiny, fragments too late, too incomplete, reminders that truth does not wait forever. For the family, grief evolved rather than ended, reshaped by knowledge without conclusion, by an understanding of how close the truth had come and how firmly it had resisted capture, and that closeness was its own kind of torment, because it denied them both ignorance and certainty. They learned to speak of the case differently, not as an open wound, but as a permanent condition, something carried forward rather than resolved, and in doing so, they became unwilling archivists of the story, correcting rumors, grounding speculation, preserving what was known without pretending it was enough. The confession, now rarely mentioned, faded into the background noise of the case's long history, cited occasionally, debated briefly, but no longer capable of commanding belief or outrage, its legacy reduced to a lesson about desperation, attention, and the hunger for endings. Years passed, and technology advanced again, raising the quiet question of whether the case might one day be reopened once more, whether some future tool might extract clarity from what had resisted every previous attempt, and investigators acknowledged the possibility without leaning on it, because hope deferred too often becomes a burden. The road remained, unchanged and unremarkable, its significance invisible to outsiders, yet for those who knew, it functioned as a boundary between before and after, a physical marker of how quickly normalcy can fracture and how slowly it heals, if it heals at all. And so the case lived on, not as an active investigation, not as a solved crime, but as a reference point, a cautionary tale whispered rather than shouted, reminding anyone who paid attention that some disappearances do not demand answers. They demand memory, vigilance, and the humility to accept that silence, once chosen, can outlast even the most determined search for truth. The memory of the case began to surface in unexpected places, not during anniversaries or official statements, but in casual moments, a comment cut short, a change of subject, a look exchanged too quickly to explain, because unresolved stories do not announce themselves, they seep into behavior, shaping it quietly over time. In classrooms, teachers avoided mentioning the year, parents warned their children about roads and strangers without naming why, and the lesson was absorbed without context, a form of inherited caution passed down without explanation, because fear does not need a narrative to survive. Former investigators, long retired, found the case resurfacing in dreams, the roadside appearing with unsettling clarity, the shoe in the dirt, the empty driver's seat, and they would wake with the same thought they'd carried for years, that the truth had been close enough to touch, yet always just beyond reach, like heat shimmering above asphalt. Occasionally, someone would leave town and speak more freely, distance loosening what proximity had tightened, and fragments would reach back through secondhand conversations, suggestions that someone had known, that someone had almost talked, that fear had arrived too early and left too late. But by the time these fragments surfaced, They were no longer actionable, only indicative. These near revelations became part of the case's mythology, not because they solved anything, but because they reinforced the central wound, the sense that resolution had been possible once, briefly, and then lost, not to chance, but to human hesitation. The family continued to mark time differently, measuring years not by milestones but by endurance, by how often the names still surfaced in conversation, by how frequently strangers reached out with theories, and by how much energy it took to respond without reopening everything they had worked so hard to carry. They learned that an unsolved case invites ownership, that everyone who encounters it feels entitled to an ending, and that entitlement can be cruel because it demands closure from those who have learned to survive without it. The town's younger generation began to ask questions, encountering the story online, stripped of nuance, condensed into headlines and speculation, and elders responded cautiously, correcting where they could, deflecting where they could not, because explaining the full truth meant admitting how easily silence had taken hold. With time, the cold case became less about the disappearance itself and more about what followed, about the years of waiting, the cycles of hope and disappointment, the confession that promised too much and delivered too little, and the collective realization that not every mystery yields to persistence alone. Legal files remained archived, available but rarely accessed, a testament to effort rather than outcome, and each time they were reviewed, they told the same story, not of failure, but of limitation, of how justice depends not only on determination, but on timing, cooperation, and the fragile alignment of truth and proof. The road continued to absorb traffic, seasons passing over it without acknowledgement, rain erasing footprints, heat warping the air above it, and in that indifference, it mirrored the passage of time itself, relentless, impartial, unconcerned with what it leaves behind. What remained was not resolution, but responsibility, the responsibility to remember accurately, to resist convenient narratives, to accept that some answers come too late to be useful but not too late to matter, and in that acceptance, the case found its final, uneasy form. Not solved, not forgotten, but embedded, a quiet testament to how a single night can echo across decades, how silence can become a participant, and how the absence of one person can reshape an entire community, leaving behind a story that does not end, but lingers, waiting, indefinitely, in the space between what is known and what will never be proven. Years later, when journalists try to chart the case as a timeline, they struggle to decide where it truly ended because there was no clean break, no final document stamped and filed, only a gradual thinning of official interest paired with a thickening of private memory, the kind that grows heavier the longer it is carried. Occasionally, a new detective would request the boxes, lifting lids that creaked with age, inhaling the dry scent of paper and dust, convinced that fresh eyes might rearrange the facts into clarity, but the facts resisted, fixed in their positions, familiar and unmoving, as if they had already decided how much they were willing to give. Every lead, once promising, now read like a warning, reminders of how easily certainty can form around incomplete information, how a confession can sound convincing without being true, how urgency can outrun verification, and how an entire town can brace itself for closure that never arrives. The suspect at the center of the shock faded back into obscurity, his words preserved in transcripts, replayed in courtrooms and living rooms alike, each time losing a little more weight, until they became what they had always been, sound without substance, an echo mistaken for an answer. For the family, acceptance did not arrive as peace, but as fatigue, the kind that settles deep in the bones, convincing them that survival itself was an act of defiance, that continuing to live ordinary lives was not betrayal, but endurance, and that memory could coexist with forward motion, however uneasy that balance felt. Community gatherings still carried an undercurrent, a shared understanding that certain topics hovered just beneath the surface, and when conversation drifted too close, someone would redirect it gently, not out of denial, but out of respect for wounds that had never fully closed. The cold case had altered the town's sense of safety permanently, introducing a subtle vigilance that never fully receded. Doors locked a little earlier, headlights watched a little longer. strangers measured not by friendliness, but by familiarity, habits shaped by an absence rather than a threat. In archives, the case remained officially open, a technicality that meant everything and nothing at once, because openness without momentum is a form of stasis, a recognition that the truth is still welcome, even if no one expects it to knock anymore. Sometimes, late at night, local radio hosts would mention it in passing, their voices lowering instinctively, as if volume itself might disturb something fragile, and callers would respond with memories rather than theories, describing where they were when the news first broke, what they felt, what they feared, anchoring the story in lived experience rather than speculation. The passage of time transformed the case into a mirror, reflecting not just what happened, but how people responded, who spoke, who stayed silent, who searched, who waited, and who learned to carry uncertainty as a permanent companion. And so the story persisted, not racing toward resolution, but settling into the long, uneasy stretch that follows unanswered questions, where the absence of an ending becomes the ending itself, a reminder that some cold cases do not conclude with truth revealed or justice served, but with a community learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to live alongside what will never be fully known. Time did not soften the case so much as redistribute its weight, pressing it into quieter corners of daily life, where it could not be argued with or disproven, only felt, and in that way endured, less as a question than as a condition the town had learned to live with. New residents arrived with no knowledge of the name or the night, and for a while that anonymity felt like relief, but it never lasted, because someone would eventually mention the road, or the year, or the cold case that once cracked the town open, and the story would surface again, tentative at first, then heavy with implication. The family stopped hoping for answers that fit neatly, understanding that if truth ever emerged, it would likely be incomplete, compromised by time, memory, and the quiet erosion of evidence, and that even certainty would not restore what had been taken, only change the shape of the loss. Investigators, when asked about it in interviews, spoke carefully, emphasizing diligence and process, but behind the language was an unspoken admission that not every mystery bends to procedure, that some cases resist resolution not because of indifference, but because reality itself can be uncooperative. The cold case lived on in training seminars and internal briefings, a cautionary tale stripped of names, used to remind younger officers of the cost of missed details and delayed action, its lessons preserved even as its answers remained absent. In the family home, photographs stayed on the walls, not as memorials, but as assertions of presence, proof that the person had existed beyond the headlines, beyond the speculation, beyond the confines of an unsolved file, and that no outcome, resolved or not, could erase that fact. Every few years, a rumor would spark briefly, a supposed witness, a recovered memory, a deathbed confession hinted at but never confirmed, and each time the cycle repeated, attention flaring, hope rising, then collapsing under scrutiny, leaving behind the familiar exhaustion that followed disappointment. The town learned to recognize these moments and brace for them, knowing how quickly anticipation could turn into collective mourning all over again, because reopening a cold case, even unofficially, meant reopening wounds that had never fully healed. What lingered most was not anger, but an unsettled quiet, a shared awareness that something essential had been interrupted and never repaired, and that the absence of resolution had become part of the town's identity, shaping how it understood justice, closure, and the limits of certainty. As years continued to pass, the case receded further into history without ever becoming history, suspended between past and present, remembered but unresolved, spoken about but never concluded. And in that suspension, the cold case remained exactly what it had always been, a story without an ending, a silence mistaken for peace, and a reminder that some truths do not reveal themselves, no matter how long they are waited for, leaving behind only the echo of questions that time itself cannot answer. The echo did not fade. It settled, becoming part of the town's background noise, as familiar and unremarked as the hum of traffic at night, present even when no one was actively listening for it. People who had lived through the original shock aged into storytellers without intending to, their recollection sharpening in some places and blurring in others, memory reshaping itself around emotion rather than accuracy, until the case existed in multiple versions at once, all circling the same unanswered center. Records aged differently than people, their facts static, unforgiving, refusing to soften or adapt, and that contrast created tension whenever the past was revisited, because lived memory wanted meaning, while documentation offered only what had been captured at the time, incomplete and indifferent to longing. The confession that once rattled the town became a reference point, not for its content, but for its impact, remembered as the moment hope spiked and collapsed, teaching an entire community how dangerous certainty could feel when it arrived too fast and left too little behind. For younger investigators encountering the case for the first time, it read like a warning etched into paper, a demonstration of how momentum can evaporate, how public pressure can distort priorities, and how the absence of a single corroborating detail can turn belief into doubt. The family continued forward without ceremony, marking anniversaries privately, avoiding public remembrance that risked turning their loss into spectacle, choosing instead to hold on to smaller rituals that honored life rather than absence. Sometimes, a familiar car would slow near the old stretch of road, its driver pausing longer than necessary, not searching for evidence, but acknowledging the place itself, as if recognition could substitute for resolution, as if being seen might matter to what had been lost there. Media interest waned into occasional retrospectives, their tone subdued, stripped of urgency, focusing less on solving the case and more on what it represented, an emblem of unanswered questions in an era that promised answers. The town's name remained linked to the cold case in search results and archives, an association impossible to erase, ensuring that even as daily life moved on, the stories stayed accessible, waiting for the curious, the grieving, and the hopeful alike. What endured was not a single theory or suspect, but a shared understanding of uncertainty, an acceptance that some stories resist conclusion, and that living with that resistance requires patience, humility, and a willingness to acknowledge limits. In the end, the cold case was no longer defined by what it lacked, but by what it revealed about time, memory, and the human need for answers, standing as a quiet reminder that absence can be as influential as presence, shaping lives long after the questions first emerged. By the 17th year after the confession that never held, the case no longer surged through the town in waves. It pulsed, slow and steady, a low-frequency presence felt more than discussed, influencing decisions in ways so subtle they were rarely traced back to their origin. Parents still glanced twice when their children stayed out late, even if they could not explain why that habit had formed, and newcomers adopted the caution without realizing it, absorbing a collective instinct shaped by an absence they never personally experienced. The cold case had become instructional in unexpected ways, shaping how people understood trust, teaching them that certainty could be manufactured, that narratives could feel complete without being true, and that silence could be mistaken for resolution when it was merely exhaustion. In private moments, members of the family revisited memories not as evidence, but as anchors, recalling voices, gestures, small details that never made it into files, reminders that the person at the center of the case had lived beyond the circumstances of disappearance. Investigators who once worked the case measured their careers against it, seeing everything that followed through its shadow, successes tempered by the knowledge that one unanswered question could outweigh dozens of solved ones, and that experience reshaped how they approached every file thereafter. The road remained unchanged, its surface repaired, its edges trimmed, its history invisible to passing traffic, yet those who knew felt a distinct heaviness when crossing it, a sensation that resisted explanation, as if the place itself remembered even when people tried not to. Occasionally, someone would ask whether the case might still be solved, and the answer, carefully phrased, revealed more about hope than probability, acknowledging that while time erodes evidence, it also erodes fear, and that one day, someone might speak simply because the weight of silence had grown unbearable. That possibility lingered without urgency, a quiet conditional that neither promised nor denied closure, allowing the community to exist in a state of suspended expectation without reopening wounds too sharply. The cold case no longer demanded attention. It commanded respect, a recognition that some stories persist not because they are unresolved, but because their impact extends beyond resolution, reshaping values, behaviors, and collective memory. As years continued to layer over the original night, the absence became less about what was missing and more about what had been learned in its wake. Lessons about patience, restraint, and the limits of control in a world that often insists on answers. And so the story carried on, not toward an ending, but into permanence, a cold case not frozen in time, but integrated into it, existing as a reminder that mystery can endure without spectacle, that questions can live without answers, and that sometimes the truest legacy of an unsolved crime is the quiet, lasting change it leaves behind. The permanence settled in fully when even anniversaries began to pass without formal acknowledgement, the date arriving and leaving like any other, marked only by a subtle shift in mood among those who remembered why it mattered, because the absence no longer needed a reminder to be felt. Stories about the cold case changed shape with retelling, losing sharp edges, gaining metaphor, becoming less about the facts and more about atmosphere, about the sense that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be corrected, only absorbed, and that transformation made the case harder to grasp but impossible to forget. Younger generations learned of it indirectly, through warnings that sounded excessive, rules that seemed rooted in caution rather than logic, and it was only later, if ever, that they discovered the origin of that vigilance, realizing that their freedom had been shaped by a loss they never witnessed. The file itself remained intact, pages yellowing but legible, evidence bags sealed, notes preserved in the handwriting of people long retired or gone. A static record contrasted sharply against the fluidity of memory, which continued to shift, reinterpret, and sometimes soften what could not be changed. Occasionally, technology advanced enough to raise questions about whether old evidence might yield something new, but each time the hope surfaced, it was met with the same restraint, the understanding that tools cannot create truth where none was captured, only clarify what already exists. The family reached a point where silence felt less like denial and more like stewardship, a way of protecting what remained from distortion, choosing not to engage with speculation that promised catharsis without substance. Public interest narrowed into niche curiosity, podcasts, forums, late-night discussions where theories multiplied unchecked, and yet none of that noise penetrated the core of the case, which remained stubbornly quiet, resistant to narrative closure. Those who had been closest to the original investigation understood that the cold case had become less about discovery and more about endurance, about how long a community could carry uncertainty without letting it harden into bitterness or fade into indifference. The town itself bore subtle markers of that endurance, a collective patience, a reluctance to jump to conclusions, an awareness that not every question yields to persistence, qualities forged not by resolution, but by restraint. In that way, the cold case reshaped the community from the inside out, not through answers, but through the long discipline of living without them, teaching a kind of quiet resilience that rarely announces itself, but leaves a lasting imprint. And as time continued forward, indifferent yet formative, the story remained exactly where it had settled, not unfinished, but unresolved by design. A reminder that some truths are not withheld by malice or incompetence, but by the simple, unyielding passage of time. Eventually, the case reached a strange equilibrium, a point where no one expected movement, yet no one dared declare it over, as if naming an ending might feel like erasure rather than acceptance. The cold case existed in parallel with daily life, not interrupting it, but informing it quietly, shaping instincts and reactions in ways that could not be measured, only observed in moments of hesitation, in decisions made with extra caution, in the way trust was extended slowly and withdrawn quickly. Former officers spoke of it rarely, but when they did, their tone carried something heavier than regret, an understanding that effort and outcome do not always align, and that doing everything right can still lead nowhere, a lesson learned too deeply to forget. The family continued to age alongside the absence, birthdays marked, milestones reached, each accompanied by a subtle recalibration of grief, because loss does not disappear, it adapts, finding new shapes that fit the years it inhabits. In public records, the case remained a line item, technically open, practically dormant, a status that mirrored the emotional state of those connected to it, open to possibility, closed to expectation. Sometimes, a familiar detail would resurface unexpectedly, a photograph rediscovered, a name mentioned in passing, and for a brief moment, the past would feel close enough to touch again, before receding, reminding everyone how fragile proximity to truth can be. The road continued its quiet work, carrying strangers who knew nothing of what had happened there and locals who knew too much, each passing through the same space with entirely different awareness, a shared geography divided by memory. The cold case no longer demanded justice in the loud, insistent way it once had. Instead, it asked for acknowledgement, for the simple recognition that something unresolved still mattered, even if it could not be fixed. That recognition became a form of respect, a way of honoring what had been lost without distorting it into certainty or spectacle, allowing the story to exist honestly, incomplete and unresolved. As decades layered themselves over the original night, the case settled into the long arc of history without ever quite becoming history, remaining present enough to shape perspective, distant enough to resist closure. And in that space between presence and absence, the cold case endured, not as a failure waiting to be corrected, but as a testament to the limits of knowledge, a reminder that some stories do not conclude with answers, only with the quiet persistence of memory.